This animal kills more people across Africa than lions do. It can outrun you on land. It can bite a wooden boat clean in half. And here is the part almost nobody believes. This creature, which spends its entire life in rivers and lakes, cannot actually swim. It gets stranger. Its closest living relative on Earth is not the pig or the horse, it's the whale. On a hot day, its own skin oozes a red fluid that works as both a sunscreen and an antibiotic. And at this very moment, a wild, breeding population of these giants is loose on the wrong continent, thousands of miles from Africa, all because of one of the most infamous criminals of the 20th century. We think we know this animal. We put it in cartoons. We give it to children as a soft, round toy, and we laugh at its shape. For most of us, the hippopotamus is almost a joke. Fat, slow, harmless, funny, and almost every part of that picture is wrong. Over the next hour, we're going to take that cartoon apart, one impossible fact at a time, and show you what's really underneath. This is the hippopotamus. On the surface, the water is perfectly still. A warm African evening. The river looks empty, just a mirror of the orange sky. And then, without a sound, two eyes rise from below. A broad grey back, and slowly, a mouth opens wider than you thought any mouth could open. Let's begin with the reason people fear it. Let's start with the reputation, because it's the part most people find hardest to believe. Across large parts of Africa, if you ask people which wild animal they fear the most, they don't say the lion, they don't say the leopard, or the venomous snake. Again and again, they say the hippo. You'll often hear a striking claim repeated in documentaries and articles that hippos kill around 500 people every year, more than lions and sharks combined. It's worth being honest with you here. That exact number is an estimate, and fact-checkers who have looked for its original source have struggled to find solid data behind it, so we won't treat it as a hard figure. But what is not in doubt is the direction of the truth. Hippos are genuinely, seriously dangerous to people, and they are widely regarded by those who live alongside them as the large animal most likely to kill you. Why? The answer is not cruelty. A hippo is not a hunter. It doesn't stalk you, and it doesn't want to eat you. It's a plant eater. The danger comes from something simpler and, in a way, more frightening: temperament and territory. A bull hippo controls a stretch of water, and he defends it without hesitation and without warning. A mother with a calf will tolerate nothing near her young. And boats, small fishing canoes, in particular, seem to trigger something in them. A hippo will rise underneath a boat, tip it, and bite down, not to feed, just to end the threat. So hold these two images together, because the whole story of this animal lies in the gap between them. On one side, the round, comic, almost cuddly shape we all recognize. On the other, a 2, 3, sometimes 4-ton animal that will decide, in a heartbeat, that you are in the wrong place. To understand how both can be true, we have to look closer at the body itself, starting with a fact that sounds impossible. We called the hippopotamus the deadliest large land animal in Africa. It's worth slowing down to understand why, because the reason is almost never what people imagine. The hippo is not a hunter. It has no interest in eating you. Nearly every serious encounter comes down to a single word: territory. A dominant bull does not defend a patch of grass. He defends water, a stretch of river, a bend, a quiet pool. That length of water is his, along with the females resting in it, and he will meet any intrusion into it as a challenge that has to be answered. This is where the danger really lies. A person in a small boat, drifting quietly with the current, may have no idea they have just crossed an invisible line. To the bull beneath them, that line is everything. He can surface without warning and a hippo can tip a boat with almost casual ease, or bring those long lower teeth down through the hull. Add a second trigger, a mother with a calf. Come between the two, even by pure accident, and you have made yourself the most serious problem in her world. And the animal is fast. We have already seen that a hippo can outrun a sprinting human on open ground, and it turns that same speed on anything it decides is a threat. The wide, open-mouthed gape that looks, in a photograph, like a yawn or even a laugh, is nothing of the kind. It is a threat display, a deliberate show of the weapons, a last warning to leave before they are used. The figure most often repeated is that hippos are behind something like 500 human deaths a year across Africa. More than lions, more than buffalo, more than the very crocodiles that share their water. That precise number is hard to verify, and you should hold it loosely, but the shape of it is not really in doubt. This is an animal that kills not out of hunger and not out of malice, but out of a simple, absolute insistence on its own space. Here is one of the strangest things about the hippopotamus, and it goes against everything the pictures tell us. This animal, which we always see half-sunk in rivers and lakes, which raises its calves in the water and spends the hottest hours of the day submerged, this animal cannot swim, not the way you might imagine. It does not paddle. It does not float lazily across deep water like a crocodile or an otter. The reason is density. A hippo's body is heavy and dense. Its bones are thick, and it carries relatively little of the fat that would help it float. Drop a hippo into deep water, and it does not bob to the surface. It sinks, and this is where the animal does something that, once you picture it, you'll never forget. Instead of swimming, it wogs. It sinks to the bottom and moves along the riverbed on its legs, in long, slow, weightless-looking strides, almost bouncing, pushing off the floor, gliding forward through the water, and pushing off again. Scientists have described it as a kind of underwater galloping. Think about what that means. Everything we find graceful about a hippo in the water, the smooth way it moves, the ease with which it disappears and reappears, is not swimming at all. It's an animal walking and running along a floor we cannot see. The water isn't holding it up. The ground is, and that single fact reshapes how you see every clip of a hippo you've ever watched. It was never floating. It was always standing on something, which raises the next question. If it's this heavy, this dense, how on earth is it also fast? Look at a hippo standing on land, and everything about it says slow. The short, thick legs, the enormous belly, almost dragging. The whole body seems built to do nothing but stand still and graze. So people assume that if they ever met one on land, they could simply walk away from it. That assumption has cost lives. On land, over a short distance, a hippo can run at around 30 kilometers an hour, roughly 20 miles an hour. Take a moment with that number. The fastest human sprinters on Earth, at the peak of a 100-meter race, touch a little over that. An ordinary person, surprised on a riverbank, has no chance of outrunning one, and a hippo doesn't need much of a reason to charge. If you're between it and the water, which is where it always wants to be, you are, in that instant, an obstacle to remove. That combination is what makes them so dangerous. The disguise of slowness wrapped around real, explosive speed. The body that looks like it can barely move, can close a gap faster than you can react. Everything about the hippo works like this. A soft, harmless-looking surface, and underneath it, something built for force. And nowhere is that clearer than in the part of the animal we are about to open up next. The mouth. To understand the hippopotamus, you have to accept that almost every part of its body is a compromise with water. Start with the sheer scale of it. A grown female weighs somewhere around 1.5 tons. A large bull can pass 2 tons, which places the hippo among the largest land animals alive, behind only the elephant and, depending on how you measure, roughly level with the rhinoceros. That is an enormous mass to haul around, and on dry land, it costs the animal dearly. In the water, it costs almost nothing. Now look closely at the head, because the head tells the whole story. The eyes, the ears, and the nostrils all sit in a neat line along the very top of the skull. That is not a quirk of design. It is the entire point. It lets the hippo lower its whole body out of sight, leaving only that thin strip breaking the surface, and still see across the water, still hear, still breathe. When it chooses to go under completely, the nostrils clamp shut and the ears fold flat, sealing the animal against the river. It can hold that dive for around 5 minutes, and it manages the whole thing remarkably, even while fast asleep. Beneath the surface, the body is doing something most large animals simply cannot. Hippo bones are unusually dense and heavy, and that weight, such a burden on land, becomes ballast in the water. It lets the animal sink rather than float, and walk in slow, deliberate steps along the bottom. The wide muzzle, the barrel of the torso, the short and enormously powerful legs, even the slight webbing between the toes, all of it is a body organized around a life spent mostly submerged. And then there is the skin, nearly hairless, surprisingly thin for such a giant, and quick to dry and crack under an open sun. It is the one part of the hippo for which water is not optional. Stay out too long in the heat of the day, and the very surface of the animal begins to fail. The hippo's yawn is famous. You've seen it 100 times, that huge, gaping stretch, the mouth opening to what looks like impossible angles. And because it's called a yawn, we read it the way we'd read our own. Sleepy, harmless, almost comical. That reading is completely wrong. When a hippo opens its mouth that wide in front of another hippo, or a boat, or a person, it is not tired. It is issuing a threat. That gape is a display, a way of saying, look how big this mouth is. Look at these teeth. Do not test me. And it is worth looking at those teeth, because they are not what a plantator's teeth are supposed to be. At the front of the mouth sit the canines and incisors, long, curved, and in a big bull. Some of them can reach around 1/2 meter in length. These are not for chewing grass. A hippo doesn't use them to eat at all. They are weapons and status symbols, kept sharp by grinding against each other every time the mouth closes. Now we come to the number everyone wants, the bite force. You'll see a figure quoted almost everywhere, around 1,800 pounds per square inch. It's a dramatic number, and it gets repeated in article after article. So let me be straight with you, because honesty matters more than drama. When you follow that figure back, trying to find the original scientific measurement behind it, it becomes surprisingly hard to trace to a solid primary source. It may well be in the right range. The hippo's bite is unquestionably among the most powerful of any land mammal, but the precise figure should be treated as often quoted, not as proven fact. We'd rather tell you what's certain than sell you a number we can't stand behind. And what is certain is more than enough. There are well-documented accounts of hippos biting clean through the hull of a wooden canoe, of a hippo's jaws being strong enough to crush a large crocodile. This is an animal that can, and does, cut a boat in half. You don't need a precise pounds per square inch reading to understand what that means when it happens near a person. So think about the full shape of this. A mouth that opens to nearly 150 degrees. Teeth as long as your forearm that were never meant for food. A jaw that can bite through solid wood. And all of it powered by an animal that would honestly rather be left alone, eating grass in the dark. The hippo is not aggressive because it's a killer by nature. It's aggressive because it is superbly, almost absurdly, well armed, and it lives in a world where the safest strategy is to make sure nothing ever gets close enough to test it. Which brings us to the strangest defense of all. One that has nothing to do with teeth and everything to do with the animal's own skin. For centuries, travelers told a disturbing story about the hippopotamus. They said that in the heat of the day, the animal appeared to sweat blood, that a reddish fluid would seep from its skin and run down its grey sides, as if the creature were bleeding from every pore. It sounds like a myth. It isn't. The hippo really does produce a red, oily secretion, but it isn't blood and it isn't sweat. It's something far more interesting than either. Chemists who studied this fluid found two remarkable compounds in it, which they named after the animal itself: hipposudoric acid and norhipposudoric acid. One of them is red, the other is orange, and together they do two jobs at once. Jobs we'd normally need a pharmacy for. The first job is sun protection. A hippo spends the day exposed to fierce African sun, and its skin is thin, almost hairless, and constantly drying out. This red secretion spreads across the skin and absorbs ultraviolet light. It works, in effect, as the animal's own built-in sunscreen. The second job is protection against infection. A hippo's life is full of wounds. Bulls fight savagely, tearing at each other with those long teeth, and they do it in warm water, thick with bacteria. Yet those wounds tend not to fester the way you'd expect. Those same compounds appear to fight bacteria, acting as a natural antiseptic smeared across every cut. Stop and appreciate what this animal is doing. Without any help, its own body manufactures a single fluid that is at once a sunscreen and an antibiotic, and applies it across its skin every single day. We spend fortunes trying to invent products that do half of this. The hippo simply sweats it. The blood that frightened travelers for hundreds of years turns out to be one of the most elegant pieces of natural chemistry on the continent. And it's only one of the ways this body has been quietly tuned for a life spent between water and air. A life that includes something as basic and as strange as how a hippo sleeps. We touched on the hippo's teeth as weapons, but there's a detail about them worth its own moment, because it explains something about how the whole animal is built. A hippo's canine and incisor teeth never stop growing. For its entire life, those tusks keep pushing out from the jaw continuously, the way our fingernails do. Biologists have a word for teeth like this. They're called ever-growing or hypsilodont, and there's a good reason. A hippo needs them. If your front teeth were fixed in size, but you use them every day to fight and to grind against each other, they would simply wear down to stumps within a few years. By growing continuously, the hippo replaces from the root everything it wears away at the tip. The fighting never blunts the weapon, because the weapon is always being rebuilt. But that same trait carries a cost, and not for the hippo, because those tusks are made of ivory, dense and workable. They have long been prized by people. Hippo ivory has its own history in the carving and trade of ivory, and at certain times it has been hunted heavily for exactly this. A tooth built to keep the animal alive in a fight became, in human hands, a reason to kill it. We'll come back to that darker thread later. For now, keep the image of that self-renewing tusk, because it's a perfect small example of the hippo's whole design. A body relentlessly maintained for one purpose: to hold its ground and to understand where that body truly comes from. We have to leave the riverbank entirely and go back tens of millions of years. If the hippopotamus is this heavily armed, a natural question follows. What in all of Africa would dare to attack one? For a healthy adult, the honest answer is almost nothing. A 2-ton animal with those jaws is simply not worth the risk, and the great predators of the continent know it. A pride of lion's might, in a hard season, test a lone hippo far from water, but it is a rare and dangerous gamble, and more often the lions simply let it pass. The real vulnerability is not the adult. It is the calf. A small hippo, still learning the river, is a target for lions on the bank, for hyenas, and above all, for the crocodiles that live in the very same water. And this is what turns a hippo mother into one of the most dangerous animals on Earth. Her aggression is not random temper. It is a direct answer to a real and constant threat to her young. The relationship with the crocodile is the strangest of all. The two giants share the same rivers, often only a few meters apart, and for the most part, they hold an uneasy truce. The crocodile keeps its distance from the adults. The hippos, for their part, frequently ignore the crocodiles altogether, resting among them, walking past them, treating them as part of the furniture of the river. When that truce breaks, it usually breaks in one direction. A bull hippo that decides a crocodile has come too close or too near the calves can seize it, crush it, or simply throw it aside with a flick of that massive head. So the picture is almost upside down from what we expect. The animal with the fearsome reptilian neighbor is not the one living in fear. In its own water, on its own terms, the hippo sits at the very top, a grazer, a vegetarian for the most part, that the crocodiles have learned, through long experience, to leave well alone. Hippo is almost never alone. Look at a good stretch of river in the middle of the day, and you will usually find not one animal, but a crowd of them, packed close in the shallows, a tangle of backs and ears and half-open eyes. A group like this goes by several names: a pod, a bloat, a school. Most often it numbers 10 to 30 animals, but where water is scarce and the dry season presses them together, a single pool can hold 100 hippos or more, wedged in shoulder to shoulder. That crowd is not a democracy. It is held together by a strict order, and at the center of that order stands a single dominant bull. He controls a length of the water and the right to mate with the females inside it. Other males are tolerated, but only for as long as they behave, keeping low, keeping submissive, making no move on his females. Let one of them push too far, and the truce collapses into exactly the kind of fight we have already seen. Teeth against teeth for the ownership of that water. And hippos talk to one another about all of this in a way that is uniquely, unmistakably their own. A bull will back up to a rival or to the edge of his patch and defecate while spinning his short flat tail like a paddle, flinging the dung in a wide arc across the ground and the reeds. It looks absurd. It is nothing of the kind. That scattered dung is a signpost and a signature at once. It marks the paths, it marks the boundaries, and it carries the animal's own scent as a plain statement of who owns this place and how large he is. So the pod that looks, from a distance, like a lazy pile of animals dozing away, the heat is really a tight and watchful society, ranked, patrolled, and constantly negotiated. Every yawn, every grunt, every arc of flung dung is a line in an ongoing conversation about space and status and water. Here's a question that sounds simple until you really think about it. A hippo spends the heat of the day resting in the water, often fully submerged. It also needs to breathe air. It is a mammal, like us. So how does an animal sleep? Underwater, without drowning. The answer is a reflex so smooth that the hippo doesn't even have to wake up to use it. A resting hippo can hold its breath for around 5 minutes at a time. When its body needs air, it rises to the surface, takes a breath, and sinks again. And it does all of this, apparently, while still asleep. The surfacing is automatic, controlled below the level of conscious thought, the way your own breathing continues while you sleep without you deciding on each breath. Picture a group of hippos resting on a riverbed. To them, this is rest. Every few minutes, one body after another drifts up, breaks the surface for a single breath, and settles back down to the bottom a slow, endless rhythm rising and falling in water they never truly leave. They are, in the most literal sense, sleeping in a place that would drown almost any other large land animal, and their bodies handle it without a thought. This is the kind of adaptation that starts to feel too neat. A land mammal so perfectly at home underwater that it can even sleep there. And it raises a deeper question. How does a creature end up this specialized for water while still needing to breathe air, still needing to walk on land to feed? To answer that, we have to look at the hippo's family tree. And what we find there is the single most surprising fact in this entire story. For all the time it spends in the river, the hippopotamus does not actually feed there. The water is where it shelters, rests, and hides from the sun. The food is somewhere else entirely, out on the land, under the cover of darkness. As the light fails and the heat drains out of the day, the hippos begin to haul themselves out of the water and set off inland. And this is a side of the animal that almost no one ever sees. They follow paths of their own making, night after night, year after year. The same heavy feet wear deep, unmistakable trails into the banks and the grassland, hippo highways, running from the water out to the grazing and back again. A hippo may travel several kilometers along these trails in a single night, far further from the river than you would ever expect such a water-bound animal to go. And they often go in single file, the whole line of them, moving quietly through the dark. Out on the grass, the feeding itself is oddly gentle for such a violent-looking animal. The hippo does not tear at the ground with those great teeth. It crops the grass with wide, tough lips, plucking it close and neat, almost like a slow mechanical mower working across the plain. Over time, a well-used feeding ground takes on the look of a mown lawn, kept short by the passage of these enormous, careful mouths. And here is the surprise. For its vast size, a hippo eats remarkably little, very roughly 40 kilograms of grass in a night, only around 1 or 2% of its own body weight, a fraction of what you might guess. The secret is the water it came from. By spending the hot day floating, supported, barely moving, the animal burns astonishingly little energy, and so it needs far less fuel than a land giant of the same weight ever could. Then, as the sky begins to pale, the whole procession turns and files back down the trails to sink once more into the safety of the river before the sun returns. It is tempting, after all that, to file the hippo away as a simple giant vegetarian, a peaceful mower of grass that just happens to be armed. And for the most part, that is true. The overwhelming bulk of a hippo's diet is grass, cropped at night, digested slowly in a large, chambered stomach that ferments the tough plant matter over long hours. The hippo is not a ruminant like a cow. It does not chew the cud, but it runs a similar patient chemistry, breaking down grass that few other animals could live on. For the most part, because the science here holds a genuinely uncomfortable surprise, and honesty means telling it plainly. Over the years, researchers have recorded hippos doing something that no textbook vegetarian should do. They have been seen feeding on carrion, the carcasses of other animals, sometimes other hippos. In a handful of documented cases, they have been observed killing and eating flesh outright. It is rare. It is clearly not their normal way of feeding. And scientists still argue about why it happens, whether it is driven by some mineral or nutrient the grass cannot supply, by the stress of drought and hunger, or by something we simply do not yet understand. But it happens, and it matters, because it breaks the cartoon a second time. We began this whole story by taking apart the idea of the hippo as fat, slow, and harmless. Here, the gentle vegetarian version comes apart in the same way. The real animal does not fit neatly into either box, not the friendly grazer, not the pure predator, but something more complicated and more interesting than either. That is worth holding on to as a habit of mind. The closer you look at almost any wild animal, the more the simple label you were handed starts to fray at the edges. The hippo just frays faster and in stranger directions than most. Look at a hippopotamus and then picture a dolphin or a great whale sliding through the open ocean. Nothing about them seems to belong to the same story. One is a grey, barrel-shaped giant standing in an African river. The other is a sleek, fin-driven swimmer that never touches land. And yet, of all the animals alive today, the closest relatives of the hippopotamus are the whales and dolphins. Not pigs, not horses, whales. This isn't a loose comparison. It comes from decades of work in anatomy and, more recently, in genetics, all pointing the same way. Long ago, somewhere in the region of 55 million years back, there lived a group of animals that would become the ancestors of both. One branch of that family walked back toward the water and, over vast stretches of time, gave up the land completely, its legs shrinking into fins, its whole body reshaping into the whales and dolphins we know. Another branch kept a foot in both worlds and became the hippos. Once you know this, you start to see the family resemblance in places you'd never have looked. Hippos and whales share features that set them apart from almost everything else. Both give birth and nurse their young in the water. Both communicate through sound carried underwater. Hippos, like whales, have no true hair coat and no sweat glands of the ordinary kind. Even the way sound travels through a hippo's jaw and in her ear echoes the deep water hearing of its ocean cousins. These aren't coincidences. They are the fingerprints of a shared ancestor. So the animal we started with, the one we mock as a fat, comic river horse, is in truth a member of one of the most extraordinary lineages on the planet. A survivor of the same ancient split that produced the largest animals ever to live. The whale in the ocean and the hippo in the river are two answers to the same old question, asked more than 50 million years ago. What happens when a mammal goes back to the water? And the hippo's answer isn't only about its own body. It reshapes the entire river it lives in, as we'll see next. A hippo doesn't just live in its river, it runs it. Scientists have a phrase for a creature that reshapes the environment around it so profoundly that other species depend on the change. An ecosystem engineer. The hippo is one of the great examples on land, and it does its engineering with the two ends of its own body. Every night, hippos leave the water and walk out onto land to graze, cropping huge quantities of grass. Then, by day, they return to the river and rest, and that is where they release most of what they've eaten. Night after night, the hippo is carrying nutrients from the land and depositing them into the water on a massive scale. In some rivers, the sheer tonnage of hippo dung entering the water each day is enormous, and with it comes a steady load of the nutrients and minerals, including silica, that the river's smallest life depends on. In this way, the hippo acts as a great pump, moving the fertility of the grassland into the food web of the river. But engineering on this scale has a sharp edge. When too much dung collects in a slow, still pool, especially in the dry season, when the water stops flowing, it can strip the oxygen out of the water as it breaks down. And when the rains finally return and flush that pool downstream, the sudden surge of low oxygen water can kill fish in large numbers. It looks, at first, like a disaster the hippos have caused, and in a narrow sense, they have. But this, too, is part of the cycle. The death feeds other things, the system resets, and the river goes on. The hippo isn't a gardener, keeping everything tidy. It's a force, one that gives and takes on a scale that shapes the whole living community around it. Remove the hippo from a river like this, and you don't just lose a big animal. You lose the pump, the flow of nutrients from land to water falters, and the whole web that quietly relied on it it begins to thin, which is worth remembering when we ask later what it would actually mean to lose them. But first, let's follow the hippo into the most hidden part of its life, the water, where it is born, and where it says almost everything it has to say. A baby hippo often takes its first breath before it has ever seen the sky. Females frequently give birth in the water, and the newborn, already weighing as much as a grown human, must get to the surface for its first breath within moments of being born. In its earliest days, the calf will even nurse underwater, closing its ears and nostrils and suckling below the surface before pushing up to breathe. For a young calf, the water is the safest place in a dangerous world. On land, a baby hippo is exposed to lions and hyenas. In the water, it stays close against its mother's enormous flank, shielded by the most fiercely protective parent on the river. A mother hippo with a calf is, by wide agreement, one of the most dangerous animals you can come near, not out of malice, but out of a defense so absolute that she leaves no margin for a mistake. And this is where the hippo's deep bond with water becomes something more than convenience. Born in it, nursed in it, hidden in it, the calf's whole early life happens below or against the surface. The river is not just where a hippo lives. It's the world it's born into, before it ever knows there is anywhere else. And that underwater world isn't silent. It's full of sound, the hippo's true language. And that language does something no other land mammals can. We have already touched the river as a place of birth. It is worth staying there a little longer, because the early life of a hippo is one of the most tender and most dangerous chapters in the whole story. After a pregnancy of around 8 months, a female usually leaves the main group to give birth, often in the water or right at its edge. Almost always there is just one calf. It arrives weighing somewhere between 25 and 50 kilograms, which sounds enormous, until you set it beside a 2-ton mother. From its very first minutes, this is an animal of two worlds. A newborn hippo can suckle underwater, sealing its ears and nostrils shut, and closing its mouth around the teat beneath the surface before pushing back up for air. In deep water, the calf will often rest on its mother's back, riding above the river while she carries it, a small dark shape balanced on that broad island of an animal. And the mother, in these wakes, is transformed. We have already met her as one of the most dangerous animals in Africa, and this is exactly why. Everything that makes an adult hippo formidable is now bent entirely toward the protection of this single, vulnerable calf against the crocodiles in the water, against the lions and hyenas on the bank, and even against other hippos, including aggressive bulls that can pose a real threat to the young. As the calves grow a little older, something rather touching happens. They gather. Young hippos come together in loose nursery groups within the pod, small clusters of calves resting near one another under the watch of the adults, a kind of creche at the heart of the crowd. It is a glimpse of a social life, far richer than the still, sleepy surface of a hippo pool ever lets on. And it is one more answer to the animal we started with. Not a lone brute in the water, but a mother, a calf riding her back, and a nursery of young growing up in the safest, most fiercely guarded stretch of the river. That deep, rolling, grunting call, the sound most people associate with a hippo, is more remarkable than it first seems. Hippos are among the most vocal of large land animals, and their calls carry across the water for long distances, holding a whole group in contact, even when they can't see one another. But the truly unusual part is not how far the sound travels, it's where it travels. Researchers have found that a hippo can call in a way that travels through the air and through the water at the same time. Part of its body lies above the surface, part below, and it can produce sound that reaches other hippos both ways at once. A hippo resting with its head up can send a signal to a companion whose ears are underwater, and to another standing on the bank in a single call. It is, in effect, speaking to two worlds in the same breath. Think about how rare that is. Most animals live in one medium and speak into it. Birds into the air, fish into the water. The hippo straddles the boundary between them and has made that boundary its home, right down to the way it talks. So much of what the hippo says, it says below the surface, where we almost never hear it, a rich, hidden conversation running through the river all day long. It's one more reminder that the animal we watch from the bank is only the visible tip of a life lived mostly out of sight. And humans, sensing that hidden power, have been telling stories about it for thousands of years, as we'll see now. Beginning on the banks of the Nile, the people who knew the hippopotamus best in the ancient world were the Egyptians, and their relationship with the animal was complicated, a mix of fear, respect, and reverence that split neatly along the line between male and female hippos. The male hippo, aggressive and destructive, trampling crops and overturning boats. They came to associate with chaos and with the god set, a figure of disorder and violence. But the female hippo, swollen with pregnancy, ferociously protective of her young, they saw as something else entirely. From the female hippo, they built one of their most beloved household goddesses, Taweret, the Great One. She was depicted as a standing hippopotamus, upright on two legs, often with the limbs of a lion and the back of a crocodile, a fusion of the very animals a mother by the Nile most feared for her children. And that was exactly the point. Taweret took the terror of the river and turned it into a shield. She was the protector of pregnant women and of childbirth, a guardian standing watch over the most dangerous, most hopeful moment in a family's life. This wasn't the belief of priests in grand temples alone. Taweret lived in ordinary homes. Archaeologists have found her image on countless small amulets, on beds and headrests, on jars and wands and everyday objects, pieces worn or kept close by women hoping for a safe delivery. Hers is one of the most frequently found figures in Egyptian household religion. For thousands of years, in the most intimate corner of ordinary life, people reached for the image of a hippopotamus for comfort. Stand back and look at the whole picture, because it captures the hippo's paradox perfectly. Here is an animal so dangerous that an entire civilization split it into two symbols: the male as a demon of chaos, the female as a beloved goddess of birth. They didn't simplify it. They didn't decide it was only a monster or only a comfort. They held both truths at once and built them into their gods, which is more or less what we've been trying to do for the last 40 minutes. The Egyptians understood, long before us, that the hippopotamus is not one thing. It is danger and protection, destruction and life, wrapped in the same grey hide. The ancient Egyptians lived beside the hippo for millennia, but the strangest chapter in the human story of this animal isn't ancient at all. It happened in our lifetime, on the wrong continent entirely. And it began with one of the most notorious criminals of the 20th century. In the 1980, at the height of his power and wealth, the Colombian drug Lord Pablo Escobar built himself a private estate, so lavish it included its own zoo. Among the animals he brought in, illegally, from far away, were a handful of hippopotamuses, a few individuals shipped across the world to stand in an artificial lake in South America, thousands of miles from any river they belonged in. When Escobar was killed in 1993 and his estate fell apart, most of his exotic animals were captured and moved, but the hippos were left behind. They were large, they were dangerous, and they were sitting in a warm lake with plenty of water and food. So they did the one thing hippos do exceptionally well when nothing is stopping them. They bred, and Colombia, it turned out, was almost perfect for them. Warm all year, wet, rich with vegetation, and completely without the droughts, the predators, or the rival hippos that would normally keep their numbers in check back in Africa. From that original handful, the population grew to dozens, and then past 100, spreading out from the old estate into the wild rivers of the region. Researchers studying them have projected that, left unmanaged, the number could climb into the many hundreds, even approaching 1,000. Within a couple of decades, they have become the largest population of hippos anywhere outside of Africa. A wild African megafauna, breeding freely on a continent where it has no natural place at all. And now Colombia faces a genuinely hard problem. These animals are dangerous to local people and disruptive to local rivers, altering the water and pushing out native wildlife. Legally, they've been declared an invasive species, but they are also beloved, a strange local attraction, and, to many, impossible to think of harming. Every option is difficult. Doing nothing lets the population keep climbing. So the hippos of Colombia sit at the center of an argument with no easy answer, a living consequence of one man's vanity that will outlast him by generations. It's a modern fable about how far the reach of this animal now extends, and a reminder that the hippo's story is no longer only Africa's to tell. There is a second kind of hippopotamus, and almost no one has heard of it. Deep in the forests and swamps of West Africa lives the pygmy hippo, a shy, solitary animal, a fraction of the size of its famous cousin. Where a big hippo can weigh several tons, a pygmy hippo weighs only a couple of 100 kilograms. Where the great hippo lives in open rivers in large, noisy groups, the pygmy hippo lives alone, hidden in dense forest, quiet and rarely seen. It's so retiring, and its forests are so hard to work in, that for a long time it was barely studied at all. Some people doubted it even existed, and it lives a very different life from its relative. It spends less of its time in water, forages alone in the forest at night, and avoids trouble rather than confronting it. If the great hippo is the river's blunt force, the pygmy hippo is its quiet ghost. But that quiet life is now under real threat. There are thought to be only a few thousand pygmy hippos left in the wild, and their numbers are falling as the forests they depend on are cut down and broken apart. They are classed as endangered. So even within this one small family of animals, we find the hippo's two faces again, the loud, dangerous giant everyone fears, and its gentle, vanishing cousin almost no one knows to miss. Which leads us to the last and most important question of all. What happens if we lose them? For an animal this powerful, the hippo's future is far less secure than you might think. The common hippopotamus is officially listed as vulnerable, with a wild population estimated somewhere in the range of 115 to 130,000 animals. That may sound like a lot, but it's spread thin across a shrinking map, and it faces two relentless pressures that have nothing to do with the animal's strength. The first is loss of habitat. Hippos need water, and they need grassland, and both are being taken up by farms and settlements as the human population grows. As rivers are diverted and land is cleared, hippos are squeezed into smaller and smaller pockets, more and more often colliding with people. The second pressure is hunting for their meat and for those ever-growing ivory teeth, which are traded much as elephant ivory is. History has already shown how fast this can go. Hippos once lived along the lower Nile, in the very heart of the civilization that worshipped them, and there they were wiped out entirely, gone by the early 19th century. An animal can be sacred and still be exterminated, and we've already seen why this matters beyond the animal itself. Remember the river. The hippo is an ecosystem engineer, the great pump carrying life from the land into the water, the force that shapes the entire community around it. Take the hippo out, and you don't simply subtract one species. You pull a thread that the whole web is hanging from. Fish, insects, birds, the chemistry of the water itself, All of it has been quietly built over ages around the presence of this animal. So let's go back one last time to where we started, to that still evening river and the two eyes rising out of it. We began with a cartoon, fat, slow, harmless, funny. We end somewhere very different, with a superbly armed survivor of an ancient line that also produced the whales, with a chemist that sweats its own sunscreen, a swimmer that cannot swim, a voice that speaks to two worlds at once, a god of birth, an engineer of rivers. The hippopotamus was never the joke we made of it. It's one of the most extraordinary animals alive, and it's asking us, quietly, from the water, whether we are paying enough attention to keep it here. That's a question worth sitting with if you stayed with us to the end. Thank you. These slow, careful looks at a single animal are what this channel is for. Not the loud version, but the true one, with the sources laid out below so you can follow them yourself. If you found something here that surprised you, the walking instead of swimming, the sunscreen in the skin, the whale in the family tree, then consider subscribing so the next one finds you. Take a moment next time you see this animal reduced to a cartoon to remember what's really underneath. And we'll see you at the next river.